This is indeed a joyous night for the human spirit. This is your victory too. You helped end apartheid. You stood with us through the transition.
This was Nelson Mandela shortly after he won the presidency of South Africa. As a leader for the African National Congress, he helped bring an end to racial apartheid in that country, a feat for which he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. He has been described as being a great and wise negotiator, idealistic, pragmatic, practical, charming, courteous, attentive, enigmatic, and private. This could be called a description of Nelson Mandela's personality. What does it mean to have a personality? What determines our personality? Are our personalities something we inherit at birth or something we develop through our life experiences? Social scientists have developed many theories to try and determine where personality comes from. Of these theories, there are currently three major ones: psychoanalytic, humanistic, and social cognitive perspectives. We will explore these three theories by applying some of their aspects to a well-known person, Nelson Mandela. How did an extraordinary personality such as Nelson Mandela develop?
When I think of Nelson Mandela, I think of the uniqueness of his life. I can't think of anybody else in world history, any part of world history, who went through the kind of transformation that he went through. He was born in 1918 at a time where he's living in a country in which his own people, black Africans, represented well over 80% of the population. Yet they had virtually no political voice. Mandela himself never voted in a government election until 1994. He was in prison from 1964 virtually continuously till 1990. Yet in his own country in 1990, Africans still did not have the vote. It was as if nothing had changed, and in many ways things had gotten much worse. Yet in a mere 4 years from the moment he stepped out of prison, he was president of the country.
Nelson Mandela emerged from Robben Island as a true hero. He was a symbol, I think, for a long time, and there was really a concern whether, when he came out of Robben Island, his symbolic stature would be tarnished by the reality of life. But he lived up to his hero status and exceeded, I think, in most people's minds.
Was Nelson Mandela born to be a leader, or was it the events and circumstances of his life that shaped him?
With regard to personality, it's important to consider the question of heredity and environment. And basically, personality theorists agree across the board that we're all born with some of the elements of personality, but the rest of the elements of personality we learn through our interaction. The interaction that takes place when we express what we're born with, and other people respond to it.
There is no one theory that adequately explains all aspects of human personality. Every theory has its own strengths and weaknesses.
The purpose of studying personality is to understand individual differences. You know, we tend to like to think of people as all the same. We know that's not true, and people are really very different.
One of the most influential figures in the study of human personality was Dr. Sigmund Freud.
Sigmund Freud was a Viennese physician. He lived around the Victorian era from about 1859 to 1939. And basically, he treated a lot of disturbed patients who seemed to have a similar theme in terms of repressed sexuality and conflicts around that repressed sexuality, which was very understandable given the Victorian time.
Psychoanalytic theory was founded by Sigmund Freud, and ultimately he settled on this kind of triumvirate of dividing our psyche into three different sections: the id, the ego, and the superego.
The id is the primitive part of the personality that is present at birth and is totally unconscious. Its drives are irrational, impulsive, and illogical. The ego is the conscious part of our personality that regulates the id and acts as the mediator between the id's instinctual demands and the realities of the outer world. The superego, which develops around the age of 5 or 6, is the further development of the consciousness that places moral and societal controls on the personality. Freud saw personality and behavior as the result of a constant interplay among these conflicting psychological forces. Psychoanalysis stresses the importance of unconscious mental processes.
What set his theory apart was that he developed basically a theory that looked at personality function in terms of a biological development that is stage and linear oriented. And interestingly enough, and these are some of the things that I think are really brilliant of Freud, he formulated that, the development of personality along this very clear biological time schedule.
Freud called this biological time schedule the psychosexual stages of development. He saw the two primary motivating forces for human behavior were sexual and aggressive energies. During the first 5 years of life, the child passes through the oral, anal, and phallic psychosexual stages. The latency stage occurs in late childhood, and the genital stage begins in adolescence.
The mother is the primary object that the infant is attached to at the very beginning. The mother-child bond is a very strong bond, and this is where the child in the oral stage develops things such as security. Both the boy and the girl initially form this bond with the mother. Later on, the father comes in, and the father becomes important in the development of the superego stage. And so the mother and the father interactions with the child are very important in helping the infant form personality tendencies that will occur later in life.
Well, Mandela was one of many children of a father who had 4 wives. The African societies were polygamous, and I don't know the number offhand, but Mandela was the youngest of many children. He had a very tenuous relationship with his father, who was both psychologically and physically distant from him when he was young, and the father died while he was only 9.
One caution I need to say is that it's difficult to really apply theories to people you don't know. I would love to meet Nelson Mandela, but I haven't met him. A lot has been written about him and about his childhood. We don't have the type of rich material that someone from a psychoanalytic framework could really use to make some assessments.
Freud considered mother and father as key figures in being strong determinants in terms of individual differences in personality outcome. All of us, according to Freud, share this, tendency to seek expression of these biological drives in the context of society.
One of the drawbacks of psychoanalytic theory is that it assumes a single mother and a single father. And one aspect of Mandela's life was that he had 4 mothers.
I think that his early childhood experiences helped him a lot with his people skills, and especially, as he notes himself, with his skills with women, because he was the youngest of his father's sons. His biological mother, as well as all of his mothers, lavished a tremendous amount of affection on him, and he traces his ability to communicate very much with not only people in general, but with women in particular to his early experiences.
Each psychosexual stage is associated with certain psychological issues. The oral stage deals with security and insecurity. The anal stage with issues of cleanliness and self-control issues. And the phallic stage deals with control of others. Freud saw each of these stages in association with a cluster of defense mechanisms.
One of the highest levels of defense mechanisms is what we call sublimation. This is where a particular issue is stirred up from one of the psychosexual stages of development, and it is transformed into something that is socially appropriate expression.
Other defense mechanisms include repression, where certain negative thoughts or emotions are completely excluded from one's conscious thought, or denial, which is the failure to recognize the existence of a problem.
In looking at Nelson Mandela's life, he seems to really have concerns for the dignity of others and the dignity of himself. A lot of things I would categorize as control of other issues. So these issues arise from the phallic stage. The way in which this is expressed, I think, is a wonderful, socially appropriate thing. I mean, he's been celebrated for these things, and so he has successfully sublimated those issues.
Mandela says his father had a profound influence on his personality and on his general persona. His father was very tall and, elegant, but much darker than he. But the main thing that he saw in his father, that he saw in himself, was a kind of a stubborn resistance to injustice.
Something I should add here about the era in which he was growing up. At that time, the racial structure in South Africa was not nearly as rigid as it became later, but there was a lot of segregation, a lot of opportunities that were readily open to white residents of South Africa were simply closed to black South Africans.
Many historians of South Africa make a distinction between apartheid and the previous system of segregation. The main point was that the earlier system was, in a way, as racially charged and separatist, but it was much more based on conventions, I would say.
Freud's psychoanalytic perspective on personality remained a dominant force on personality theories until the late 1950s, when it began to be challenged by the emergence of humanism.
The humanistic perspective on personality emerged as a kind of reaction to Freud. Freud's theory of personality, which was more or less the first one in psychology and psychiatry, seemed very pessimistic to humanistically oriented people. It was pessimistic in the sense that people are born selfish, original sin, and can never give that up because it's part of their biology.
The two most important figures who helped us transition from the pessimism of psychoanalysis to the optimism of humanism were Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow. Rogers and Maslow emphasized human potential along with self-awareness and free will. One important part of Maslow's and Rogers' theory was that of the fully functioning person.
A fully functioning or self-actualized person would have certain characteristics. That person would trust his own judgment a lot. He wouldn't be looking to other people to know what makes sense. He wouldn't just be the same year after year, be flexible and change a lot. His social relationships would be characterized by intimacy rather than contractuality. Basically, it was a very optimistic, positive view of life.
Carl Rogers felt that life put up roadblocks or prevented us from growth. And so part of his form of therapy was to give what he would call unconditional positive regard.
An example of unconditional positive regard would be that of a parent, while correcting a child's behavior, would do it in such a way that the child would understand that it was the behavior that was wrong and not the child. Thus, the child would be able to learn acceptable behavior without diminishing her feelings of self-worth.
The way I would relate Nelson Mandela to humanistic psychology comes from a quote that I don't have at my fingertip right now, but in essence what Mandela said was, we do not fear failure. Our greatest fear is that we will succeed far beyond our wildest imagination. And that really is, in essence, the humanistic philosophy. And so I think his overall sense of what an ideal world should be was his driving force. I also think that he had very humanistic notions when he felt that everybody deserved to be treated with dignity. And I've read where he treats other world leaders and servants exactly the same, that he feels that everybody deserves dignity. And in essence, he is practicing unconditional positive regard.
Humanism has had quite an effect recently in the study of personality. Its heyday was in the 60s and 70s, and it certainly had a lot of effect on people in general then. The problem with with humanism is that it just looks on the bright side of things. It just assumes that everything turns out well, whereas we all know from living our own lives that that isn't true.
Well, Rogers put the emphasis on the self-concept as the central factor in human behavior. But in that theory, the self-concept was treated as sort of a global self-image. And those who have continued to work in this area have really tried to break it down into self-conception in different areas of life.
While the humanistic approach emphasizes the fulfillment of a person's unique potential, the social cognitive approach places more emphasis on learning and conscious cognitive processes.
The social cognitive approach actually has its roots in behaviorism. And originally behaviorists felt that it was kind of a stimulus-response environment, that the environment gave us a stimulus and we responded to that stimulus. Behaviorists really took that approach because they wanted to only focus on those things that are observable.
One pioneer of the theory of behaviorism was famous American psychologist B.F. Skinner.
Skinner's theory highlighted the importance of the environment in influencing behavior. And then he made some methodological contributions, particularly using the single case design, where you vary environmental conditions and then you observe what effect that has on a behavior. But he pushed environmentalism to the extreme, where the assumption was that our behavior is shaped and controlled by the environment.
Although several contemporary personality theorists have embraced the social cognitive approach to explaining personality, probably the most influential has been Albert Bandura.
Albert Bandura, although agreeing with that aspect of behaviorism, also added a piece, and that is the notion of observational learning, that we don't only have to learn by doing, we could learn by observing. So this notion of modeling had come into play. Later on, Bandura also added kind of a cognitive aspect. So his theory is kind of a social learning, social cognitive theory. And he's most famous for something that we call self-efficacy.
I treat self-efficacy as the foundation of human motivation and action. Unless people believe that they can exercise control by their actions, they have little incentive to act or to persevere in the face of difficulties. So whatever other factor may guide and motivate us, they're rooted in the core belief that we have the power to effect change by our actions. Now, human well-being and motivation and accomplishment really rely on an optimistic sense of efficacy.
Social cognitive theory says that the two most important ways of discovering our own efficacy are by actually doing something and through observation.
See, we come with very few inborn skills, and we have a long period of immaturity in which we have to acquire a tremendous range of complex skills. And so what we've evolved is an advanced capacity for observational learning that enables us to acquire competencies vicariously rather than having to go through this tortuous process. This becomes a very critical capacity. We also have the capacity for forethought. We can project into the future and organize our behavior. We set goals, we anticipate consequences to our behavior, we have plans, and this enables us to be self-regulators of our own behavior, and it gives us the capacity for self-directedness.
One of the aspects of Bandura's theory was that quite often we model ourselves after those people who are important to us, those people that we see as being similar to us. Mandela kind of looked at his life and from his recollections of his father. Nelson remembers his father being kind of stubborn and also being very strict. And he said of his father, and this is a quote from his book, Long Walk to Freedom, "He could be exceedingly stubborn, another trait that may unfortunately have been passed down from father to son." He sees these traits of his father's that actually had a great deal of relevance to how he changed a nation.
The first step Nelson Mandela took towards making a difference in his own life was to study law and become a lawyer, one of the few professions open to black South Africans at that time. It was while advocating for the civil rights of his people that he became politically active. Eventually, his political activities resulted in his being arrested.
He was arrested for sabotage and was put on trial for sabotage in a capital offense, and his life was at risk in this trial. Yet during the trial he defended himself, and very eloquently. He used the trial as a platform for expressing African views on the laws and South African society, and was actually allowed to speak at great length. The trial got international coverage, and that's really what made him a world figure, was what he had to say during the trial, even though he knew that by defending himself as he was and not trying to get out of the charges, he admitted the charges, that he would be found guilty and very likely sentenced to death. As it happened, he was sentenced to a life imprisonment.
Once we adopt standards, we tend to do things that give us a sense of self-worth and self-satisfaction, and we refrain from behaving in ways that will bring self-censure. And so often our self-standards conflict with the social pressures for behavior, and in such cases it's not unusual for people to endure hardships or even punitive treatment rather than accede to what they regard as unjust or immoral.
I saw an interview with Nelson Mandela talking about his prison years. And he was sent to like the most austere of the prisons that South Africa had. And yet, even in these conditions, he still carried himself with a sense of dignity, no matter how much the guards would try to abuse him or treat him very poorly. He had this strong sense of self and strong sense that he deserved more. And he also treated the guards with dignity, too. And I think that it was hard for them to treat him with contempt because he treated them with so much respect.
Mandela's ability to influence his environment, even in prison, could be called an example of reciprocal determinism.
Reciprocal determinism simply recognizes two-way causation, that we are producers as well as products of our everyday circumstances.
Nelson Mandela became a world symbol of the oppression of apartheid in his country. After 26 years of imprisonment, he was finally freed. He worked with then South African President F.W. de Klerk to write a new constitution that would allow open elections.
This was the first time in the entire history of the country that there was an election open to everybody. I think the election took place over 2 days and was comparatively peaceful.
While the social cognitive perspective on personality theory is one of the more current theories, it is still evolving. As psychologists and social science researchers continue to learn more about personality, theories will almost certainly change.
It's gone through many transformations. You see, originally it was heavily oriented in the behavioristic model, and then it's shifted markedly to a more cognitively oriented model. We see people as embedded in social networks, and their development and adaptation and change really involve very complex interactions of different subsystems in a society. So I would say that the major changes are the move in the direction of more cognitively oriented theorizing, and also recognizing the tremendous complexity of human development and change.
Individual functioning is going to be more and more important in the 21st century, and personality theories may help guide us in understanding how that can happen and how to bring it about in child-rearing practices in the schools, things like that.
We can never answer the question, was nature or nurture more influential in the life of Nelson Mandela? But we can address, through personality theories, what roles do nature and nurture play in the development of personality. One thing we are sure of, however, is that Mandela's place in history is unquestionable.
That he was able to emerge as a person who could serve as a catalyst to dismantling the apartheid system and replace it with a government that was able to assume power in an orderly way without dramatic upheavals and bloodshed is extraordinary. And I can't imagine many human beings who could have done what Nelson Mandela did in that culture. So he's a true world hero.